Or 5 long years, life became a cycle of alarm clocks at dawn, late-night shifts, and dreams placed carefully on a shelf, all for someone else's future. I remember the beginning so vividly that sometimes it feels like a memory my mind refuses to let fade, no matter how much I try to reorder the past. Supporting a medical degree sounded noble at first, like a mission the heart could hold with pride. I believed in ambition, in shared goals, and in the kind of love that grows through sacrifice. So when the tuition bills came, I paid them. When rent was due, I covered it. When textbooks needed to be bought, when exam fees arrived, when lab coats tore or stethoscopes went missing, my hands were the ones reaching for my wallet. Every expense was a promise I kept, telling myself that one day all this effort would be worth it, that the future we imagined together needed time, patience, and investment. It was easy to ignore how much I was giving up when the person I loved kept assuring me that everything I did mattered. Those first years passed in a blur of double shifts, extra shifts, overtime hours, and exhaustion that settled into my bones like a second skin. I used to joke that my life was measured in paychecks instead of days, each one disappearing before I even got the chance to remember what I earned it for. I had dreams once, traveling, starting a small business, maybe going back to school myself, but dreams require time and financial breathing room, both of which I willingly surrendered. I cut corners everywhere I could, cheaper groceries, skipping outings with friends, wearing the same shoes until the soles thinned out. I didn't complain. Love can convince you that suffering is a kind of devotion, that giving more than you receive is normal if the destination promises happiness. Every time I saw a new semester begin, and every time I watched the person I was supporting walk into class with hope shining in their eyes, I told myself it was enough to keep going. The hardest part wasn't the work itself, it was the loneliness that gradually crept in without warning. At first, the distance was easy to rationalize. Medical school is demanding. There were exams, late-night study groups, endless lectures, and clinical rotations that stretched into weekends. I told myself that the growing silence wasn't something to fear. But little by little, even in the small moments when we were together, I felt like a visitor in someone else's life. I would come home exhausted, expecting perhaps a comforting word or simple acknowledgement, but instead I found them lost in textbooks or staring at their phone with a smile that wasn't meant for me. I ignored it. I thought dedication to academics explained everything. I thought temporary distance was the price of a shared future. I kept working, kept paying, kept believing. My own family began to worry. They told me I looked tired, that my spark was fading, that I was giving too much. I brushed off their concerns, insisting that relationships require sacrifice, that someday I would be proud of the role I played in building a doctor's career. I didn't tell them about the times I cried quietly in the bathroom after receiving a message that said, "I'll be home late, don't wait up." I didn't tell them how often I felt invisible. I protected the image of our relationship the way someone protects a fragile glass sculpture, afraid that if I admitted it was breaking, it would shatter completely. So instead, I tightened my grip on it, even when the edges cut into my hands. 5th year brought more pressure for both of us. For them, it was the final push to graduate. For me, it was the moment where exhaustion began to transform into a quiet resentment I wasn't ready to acknowledge. The bills grew heavier, and so did the emotional distance. I couldn't remember the last time we had gone out together, the last time we had cooked a meal side by side, or the last time they asked about my day with genuine interest. Conversations became transactional, like brief exchanges between 2 roommates rather than partners. I kept pretending not to notice because admitting the truth meant admitting that my sacrifices might have been made for someone who had already mentally left. Still, I pushed forward, the way someone trudges through deep snow because turning back seems harder than continuing. I reminded myself of the graduation that awaited us. I pictured the ceremony, their smile, the celebration afterward, the gratitude I hoped would finally flow toward me after years of pouring everything I had into someone else's success. In my imagination, that day was a shining turning point. I believed things would get better. I believed that all the distance, all the financial strain, all the emotional emptiness would fade once the burden of school was lifted. Looking back, the signs were always there. The whispered calls they took in another room, the sudden interest in dressing better, going out more frequently, claiming it was part of networking, the new friends whose names I barely knew, the way they no longer reached for my hand, even unconsciously. The way they seemed nervous whenever I asked about the future we had once planned so openly. I noticed all of it, but I buried every concern beneath the weight of my financial commitment. I didn't want to believe that someone could accept so much from me while giving so little in return. When graduation finally came, I felt a strange mixture of pride, relief, and anxiety. I had held us together financially for half a decade. I had waited for this day like someone stranded in darkness waiting for sunrise. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with applause, flowers, and cameras flashing everywhere. I waited for a moment, any moment, where they would look at me with appreciation, gratitude, or even just recognition of everything I had done. But their eyes kept scanning the crowd for someone else, someone who eventually walked over and hugged them with a familiarity that cut through me like a blade. I stood there, clapping, smiling stiffly, pretending everything was fine. After the ceremony, when the crowd began to disperse, I expected us to leave together. Instead, I was asked to go home alone because they had plans with classmates. I didn't protest. I simply nodded and walked away, feeling something inside me crumble silently. That night, I stayed awake for hours, wondering why I suddenly felt like a stranger standing outside a life I had built with my bare hands. I told myself I was overthinking. I assured myself that tomorrow things would return to normal, that graduation stress had simply overshadowed everything else. I was wrong. The next morning, they sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table I had eaten cheap meals on to save money for their tuition, and told me they wanted a separation. They said they felt trapped, that they needed to find themselves, that they couldn't continue in a relationship that no longer aligned with the person they had become. Every word felt rehearsed, distant, clinical, almost like a diagnosis delivered without sympathy. I listened in silence, unable to process how the person I had sacrificed everything for could look at me with eyes so cold and detached. There was no acknowledgement of the years I spent breaking my own back to support them. No mention of my dreams postponed. No gratitude. Just a calm declaration that the relationship was over. In that moment, I felt the full weight of 5 years crash down on me. All the extra shifts, all the compromises, all the loneliness, all the love I gave freely. It suddenly felt like a massive debt I had paid to someone who never intended to stay. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask how they could walk away so easily. But instead, I sat there quietly, feeling myself shrink into a version of me I no longer recognized. They packed their things within hours, leaving me with empty drawers, unanswered questions, and a silence far heavier than any financial burden I had ever carried. For weeks after, I moved through life in a haze. The apartment felt like a museum of sacrifices, every object a reminder of what I had given up. I would reach for my phone to share something and then remember there was no one on the other end anymore. I struggled to eat, struggled to sleep, struggled to understand how someone could accept so much love and offer betrayal in return. Friends tried to comfort me, but their words felt distant. How could anyone understand the pain of watching the person you supported for years walk away the moment they no longer needed you? Despite the heartbreak, something unexpected began to grow inside me. A quiet strength I didn't know I possessed. I realized that surviving those 5 years required resilience, discipline, and dedication. I realized that the dreams I had pushed aside were still waiting for me. I realized that I had built someone else's future at the cost of my own. And now I finally had the chance to reclaim mine. It began so subtly that I almost missed it, the way emotional distance often sneaks into a relationship, like a shadow that doesn't match the light. At first, everything seemed normal. We still shared the same home, the same routine, the same unspoken rhythm that couples build over time. But as graduation drew closer, something in the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was quiet. almost gentle in the beginning, the kind of change you only notice when it starts piling up, layer upon layer, until you finally look at the person beside you and realize you can't remember the last time you truly felt close to them. The earliest sign was the lack of conversation. Not arguments or tension, just the absence of real talking. There were days when they'd leave early in the morning, so early that the sky was still a soft gray, and return so late that I was already half asleep. They always had a reason: study groups, extra rotations, meetings with professors. I believed it all. Medical school is demanding, brutal even. Long hours, relentless pressure, constant studying. When someone is pushing that hard, you tell yourself that their distance has nothing to do with you. But then days became weeks, and weeks became months, and suddenly our home felt less like a shared space and more like a rest stop they occasionally passed through. Meals together became rare. I used to cook dinner and wait, telling myself they'd walk through the door any minute. But the food grew cold more often than it was eaten, and eventually I stopped trying. They started picking up food on the way or eating on campus. They would mention it in passing, a quick, thoughtless comment thrown over a shoulder as they rushed out again. It wasn't the missed dinners that hurt the most. It was the realization that they hadn't even noticed I'd stopped making them. Then there were the late nights. At first it made sense. Students preparing for finals often stayed out late. But these late nights had a different energy, not frantic studying or exam anxiety, but something looser, vaguer. They came home with a different scent lingering on them, the sterile smell of hospital corridors mixed with something unfamiliar. Sometimes it was perfume, sometimes a cologne that didn't belong to either of us, sometimes a faint trace of alcohol even though they insisted they had been studying. I tried to ignore it, to give them the benefit of the doubt. We had been together long enough that trust felt natural, even automatic. But the unfamiliar sense kept returning, and each time I swallowed a question that felt too heavy to ask. The unexplained absences soon became routine. They stopped telling me where they were going, or if they did, their answers were vague. "I'll be out," they'd say, grabbing their bag and heading toward the door without looking back. "Don't wait up." I would watch them leave, that single sentence echoing inside me with a sharpness that felt almost physical. It was such a simple phrase, yet it carried so much distance, so much unspoken separation. It felt like a door closing slowly but firmly. There were weekends when they didn't come home at all. They always had an excuse ready: group projects, on-call rotations, emergency shifts, all plausible, all reasonable. But the explanations began to sound rehearsed, delivered with a flatness that made them feel like scripts rather than truths. I never accused them of lying, never even voiced my doubts out loud. Instead, I carried them quietly, letting them settle into my chest like stones. Their behavior at home also changed in ways that were subtle but deeply unsettling. They stopped asking about my day, stopped noticing when I was exhausted or worried or hurting. It was as if their eyes no longer registered my presence in the room. They walked past me without pausing, sat beside me without touching, slept next to me without reaching out. I felt like furniture, present, dependable, unnoticed. Sometimes when they worked late, I'd sit on the couch and stare at the door, waiting for the sound of keys turning in the lock. The hours would pass, the sky outside turning from black to blue, and when they finally walked in, they'd barely speak, barely look at me, heading straight to the shower or collapsing into bed without a word. I would lie awake beside them, listening to their slow, even breathing, wondering when the last time had been that they held me without being asked. Social media revealed another layer of distance. They started posting more, sharing photos with classmates I'd never met, smiling in group pictures where I didn't exist. There were outings, dinners, celebrations, all without me. When I asked about them, they shrugged it off, saying the outings were last minute or too exhausting for me after my long workdays. I knew that wasn't the reason. I knew because their classmates seemed increasingly present in their life. While I became more invisible with each passing day, I noticed the way their face lit up when a certain name appeared on their phone, how their voice softened during those late-night calls they took outside, how their posture changed, relaxed, as if the person on the other end understood them in a way I no longer could. I shouldn't have listened, but I did. Just for a moment, just long enough to hear a laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in months. It was then that something inside me cracked, a small fracture that would slowly deepen as the days went on. The detachment wasn't loud or explosive. It was slow erosion. A gradual wearing away of everything that once held us together. They no longer reached for my hand when we walked side by side. They stopped kissing me goodbye. They didn't ask what I wanted, didn't include me in decisions, didn't bother to hide their disinterest. It was as if they were already gone, still physically present, but emotionally absent. I tried to fix things. I suggested a date night, something simple, something to reconnect. They agreed half-heartedly, and when the evening came, they spent most of it checking their phone. The conversation felt forced, every word heavy, strained, unnatural. The distance between us at that small restaurant table felt wider than any physical space. By the end of the night, I realized I was the only one trying. I was the only one fighting for something that no longer felt mutual. The home we once shared became filled with silence, not peaceful silence, but the kind that makes your heart ache, the kind that feels like a reminder of everything that used to be, the kind that whispers truths you don't want to hear. They moved through the rooms like a visitor, taking up less space emotionally even as their belongings remained scattered everywhere. Nights became the hardest. I would lie awake, listening to them breathe beside me, wondering how someone could be so close physically yet so impossibly far. I wondered if they noticed the distance at all, or if they had already accepted it quietly, waiting for a moment to finally sever the tie completely. I wondered if they felt any sadness, any guilt, any lingering attachment. Their calmness suggested otherwise. The emotional gap widened until it became something tangible, something I could feel like a cold draft passing through the walls. It felt like we were two people living parallel lives, moving beside each other but never truly touching. Some mornings I would wake up and forget for a split second that things had changed. But then I'd see them on their phone, smiling at a message. And the truth would return like a sharp, unwelcome reminder. The graduation countdown only intensified the distance. It became clear that the closer they got to their new life, the further they drifted from the life we once shared. Every milestone, every accomplishment, every step toward their future seemed to pull them away from me. I could almost see the invisible thread between us stretching thinner, weaker, ready to snap at the slightest pull. The emotional distance had become undeniable. It wasn't a matter of miscommunication or temporary stress. It was a quiet, persistent unraveling, and though I didn't want to admit it at the time, deep down I knew that something was ending, long before the final blow arrived. Graduation day was supposed to be the finish line of everything we had endured together. The years of sacrifice, the long nights, the financial strain, the missed moments, and the relentless pressure. In my mind, it was the day everything would finally make sense, the day all the emotional distance would melt away, replaced by pride, gratitude, and a new beginning. I had rehearsed the scene so many times. The smile they'd give me as they walked across the stage, the warm hug afterward, the simple words of acknowledgement that I had waited years to hear. In my imagination, graduation day was a kind of rebirth for both of us. But reality had other plans. The morning started quietly. They got ready faster than usual, moving through the apartment with a sense of purpose that should have been exciting but instead felt cold. I had bought a bouquet the night before, white lilies, their favorite, and placed it on the table. They barely glanced at it. Their mind was elsewhere, far out of reach. Still, I clung to the belief that the day's emotions would eventually soften them, draw them back toward me. We drove to the venue in silence. The car ride felt strangely heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts neither of us dared to voice. I tried to make small talk, commenting on the weather, the decorations we passed, the excitement buzzing in the air from other students and families. But they only nodded, offering short, clipped responses. I told myself it was nerves, the weight of the moment, the pressure of stepping into a new chapter. I didn't want to consider any other possibility. At the venue, they walked ahead of me almost the entire time. I watched them from behind, seeing how they blended easily with their classmates, laughing, exchanging handshakes and cheerful greetings. For them, it seemed effortless to be present in the moment. For me, it felt like I was standing outside a world I had spent 5 years supporting, but was no longer welcome in. When they were called to the stage, my heart should have been bursting with joy. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness wash over me. Their smiles shone brightly for everyone else, the classmates, the cameras, the professors. Not once did their eyes seek mine in the crowd. I clapped anyway, holding onto the bouquet and the fragile hope that things would shift once the ceremony was over. As soon as the caps were tossed into the air and the applause faded, I expected them to come running toward me. Instead, they drifted deeper into their crowd of peers. I tried to approach them, weaving through the sea of families, taking pictures and celebrating. When I finally reached them, they were posing for photos with a group of people I had only heard about in passing. I watched their arm drape comfortably around someone else's shoulders, watched them laugh freely in a way they hadn't laughed with me in months. I felt invisible, holding the bouquet that was starting to feel foolish in my hands. When they finally noticed me, their expression wasn't one of excitement or affection. It was surprise, maybe even discomfort. They took the flowers from me politely, almost formally, as if accepting a gift from someone they barely knew. The warmth I had once seen in their eyes was gone. "Thanks," they murmured, already glancing back at their friends. I tried not to let the disappointment show. I thought maybe we could go out to eat after this. Just the two of us. Their face stiffened. "I actually have plans with the group. We're going to celebrate together." I forced a smile, trying to steady my voice. "Okay, later then?" They hesitated, their jaw tightening for a split second before they whispered, "We need to talk later." My stomach dropped. Those words, so simple, so ominous, struck me harder than any silence ever had. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. While they celebrated with their classmates, I walked around aimlessly outside, pretending to be occupied, pretending not to feel the growing dread inside me. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart stopped, but the messages were never from them. For hours I waited for the conversation they said we needed to have, rehearsing in my mind all the rational explanations that might follow. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe they wanted to talk about moving plans, or the stress of transitioning into their career. I clung to any illusion that didn't involve the worst-case scenario. When the sun began to set, they finally called, their voice calm and unreadable. They asked me to meet them at home, saying we needed privacy. I drove back in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sunset painted the sky in colors that should have been beautiful but felt eerily painful to look at. Every passing moment tightened the knot in my chest. When I walked into the apartment, I immediately sensed something was wrong. They were sitting at the kitchen table with their hands folded, the same way someone prepares themselves to deliver unwelcome news. They didn't congratulate themselves on graduating, didn't share their excitement, didn't thank me for being there. The air felt heavy, suffocating. "We should talk," they started, their voice soft but unwavering. I sat down, feeling the air turn colder around me. They didn't even look at me directly at first, staring at their hands as if searching for the right opening line. "I know today was a big day," they began, "and I don't want to ruin it for you." "For me?" I echoed, confused by the phrasing. They sighed, finally lifting their eyes. "I'm ending the relationship." The words hit me with such force that I felt physically winded. My breath caught, my heartbeat stuttered, my vision blurred for a moment. Everything around me went quiet, like the world had paused to let the shock settle in. "What?" I whispered, though I had heard perfectly well. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," they continued, speaking slowly, carefully, like they didn't want to trigger an emotional reaction. "We've grown apart. I've changed. I'm not the same person I was when we first got together. Is this because of someone else?" The question escaped me before I could stop it. They hesitated just long enough for me to understand the truth without any verbal confirmation. "It's not about someone else," they lied gently. "It's about me. I need space. I need to focus on my own future. I can't be in this relationship anymore." The room suddenly felt too small. My mind raced through the years I had spent working extra jobs, paying tuition, handling bills, sacrificing every personal dream just to make sure they could graduate without debt or worry. I had held them up when they were overwhelmed, supported them when they doubted themselves, stayed awake during their study nights, encouraged them through every exam and rotation. 5 years of my life had been poured into their success. And now, on the very day they achieved it, they were telling me they no longer wanted me. I wanted to speak, to ask why, to demand explanations, to scream about the unfairness, the betrayal, the timing. But the words refused to form. My voice felt trapped somewhere behind my ribs. All I could do was stare at them, wondering how someone could deliver such a devastating blow with such calmness. They kept talking, their tone almost clinical, as if distancing themselves emotionally made it easier to sever the connection. They mentioned needing independence, wanting to explore new opportunities, feeling suffocated by the relationship, excuses that might have made sense in another context, but not here, not today, not after everything I had given. The more they spoke, the more it became clear that they had made this decision long before graduation day. I realized the emotional distance I had felt wasn't temporary stress or exhaustion. It was preparation. Preparation to leave, preparation to start a new chapter without me. At one point, they said they hoped we could stay friends. The words felt like salt on an open wound. I wanted to laugh bitterly, to ask how anyone could expect friendship after this kind of betrayal. But my voice still refused to cooperate. Instead, I sat there quietly, tears finally slipping down my cheeks without permission. They didn't reach out. They didn't offer comfort. They simply watched, expression neutral, as if my pain didn't concern them anymore. When they finally stood up, they said they would start packing some things tonight and the rest later in the week. The decision was final. It had been final long before they spoke it aloud. The moment the bedroom door closed behind them, the silence that filled the apartment was unbearable. It was the silence of a future ripped away. A silence that swallowed the echo of all the sacrifices I had made, a silence that made the truth unmistakably clear. Graduation day wasn't just the end of their academic journey, it was the end of us. And they had planned it that way all along. ChatGPT said, "Brr." Truth didn't arrive like a thunderstorm. It didn't crash into my life with dramatic force or loud revelations. Instead, it seeped in quietly, like water through a crack in the ceiling, slow at first, then steady, then impossible to ignore. After the breakup on graduation day, I spent days walking around the apartment in a fog, replaying every moment, every word, every sign I dismissed as stress or exhaustion. My heart kept asking questions my mind didn't want to face. Why now? Why so suddenly? Why after everything I had done? I wanted to believe their explanation. I wanted to accept their words at face value, that they simply needed space, wanted independence, felt trapped in a long-term relationship that no longer aligned with who they were becoming. But a part of me, a quiet part buried deep beneath years of trust and love, whispered that their story didn't fit. Something about their tone that day, the way they avoided my eyes, the way they spoke like someone rehearsing lines, they all felt too practiced, too planned. Still, I didn't push, I didn't investigate right away. I was too heartbroken, too exhausted, too overwhelmed by the sudden collapse of the life I had invested half a decade into. Sleep eluded me. My appetite disappeared. I moved through the motions of living like someone observing life through thick glass. But even in that numb state, small clues began to drift into my awareness. It began with the phone. They had forgotten to take one of their older phones when they left, a cracked device they claimed was no longer functional. For days it sat in a drawer untouched. I didn't intend to go through it. I didn't want to be that person. But grief has a way of weakening moral lines, and betrayal, suspected or confirmed, pushes people toward truths they aren't ready for. One night, when the ache in my chest refused to let me sleep, I found myself staring at the drawer, my mind replaying the unanswered questions like a looping film. I opened the phone, expecting it to be locked, expecting my impulse to be futile. But it wasn't locked. They had either forgotten or didn't care enough to reset it. A wave of guilt ran through me as I scrolled through apps, but an even stronger wave of desperation pushed me forward. I needed answers, needed closure, needed to understand why 5 years of sacrifice could be discarded so quickly. Their messages were sparse, most deleted, most irrelevant. But one name appeared more frequently than others. A name I recognized only vaguely, someone they had mentioned once or twice as a classmate. My pulse quickened. I opened the conversation. The thread was shorter than I expected, but it didn't need to be long to deliver the blow. The messages were affectionate, intimate, and dated far earlier than the breakup. Their connection had begun months before the emotional distance fully settled into our relationship. The messages spoke of study dates that weren't just academic, of late-night study sessions that meant something far different than what I had believed, of stolen moments shared in hospital hallways and quiet corners of the library. There were jokes, inside references, promises of a future that didn't include me. There were photographs, the two of them smiling, arms around each other, faces close in a way that made my stomach twist. But the message that shattered me completely wasn't the affectionate one. It was a single line buried deep in the conversation: "I'll tell them after graduation." I stared at it for a long time, the meaning sinking in slowly, painfully. The timing wasn't an accident. The breakup wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, calculated. They had decided long ago that our relationship would end the moment they no longer needed my support. I wasn't a partner in their eyes. I was a stepping stone, a financial safety net. Someone who existed to help them reach their dreams, only to be discarded the moment those dreams were realized. The room around me blurred as tears filled my eyes. My chest tightened, breath faltering. It felt like someone had reached into my chest and pulled out the truth with bare hands, leaving my insides raw and exposed. I thought I had prepared myself for the possibility of someone else, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality that I had unknowingly funded and supported the very relationship that replaced me. My mind raced back through all the signs I had ignored: the late nights, the unfamiliar scents, the vague answers, the emotional withdrawal, the whispered phone conversations. They weren't signs of stress. They were signs of someone dividing their life in two. One part they kept at home, the other part they shared with someone I didn't even know existed. The betrayal didn't stop at the emotional connection. As I kept scrolling, more messages unfolded, revealing a truth even more devastating. They had discussed me, my sacrifices, my support, my presence in their life. And the tone wasn't grateful, it was dismissive, cold. In one message, they admitted they felt obligated to stay until graduation. In another, they said I was too dependent, even though it was them who leaned on me for everything, emotionally, financially, practically. The worst message of all simply read, "They won't fight back, they're too understanding." I dropped the phone, my hands trembling, my vision clouded with tears. To see myself reduced to a predictable afterthought, someone easy to leave, someone whose kindness had been interpreted as weakness. It was a pain deeper than anything I had felt on graduation day. It was a betrayal that reached back into every year I had spent believing in a future together, staining every memory with dishonesty. I sat on the floor for what felt like hours, trying to piece together the fragments of my heart. The truth was overwhelming, a flood too heavy for one person to carry. The heartbreak wasn't just from the infidelity. It was from the realization that the love I had nurtured had not been reciprocated for a long time, that I had been living in a story I wrote alone, while they lived a double life. But the truth didn't stop with the messages. Over the next few days, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. Mutual acquaintances reached out, some subtle, some concerned, some apologetic. One friend, hesitant but honest, told me they had seen the two of them together months earlier, holding hands outside the hospital after a late-night rotation. They hadn't said anything because they assumed I already knew. Another friend admitted they had noticed the change in my partner's behavior but didn't want to interfere. The final confirmation came unexpectedly: a social media post, a photo of them together, smiling at a celebration dinner shortly after graduation, captioned with something that made my stomach churn. The caption wasn't romantic, but it was intimate enough to reveal everything I had feared. Their body language spoke volumes. Their closeness was unmistakable. The timing of the post, just days after the breakup, left no room for doubt. I felt anger rise in me, slow and simmering. Not the explosive kind, but the deep internal anger that grows from years of betrayal, from every sacrifice made in blind loyalty. I thought about the jobs I had taken, the hours I had worked, the dreams I had set aside. I thought about the emotional labor I had poured into supporting them. I thought about the future I had imagined, a future they destroyed without hesitation. But beneath the anger, there was heartbreak so profound it felt like a physical wound. Not only had I lost the person I loved, but I had lost the version of myself who believed in that love. I felt foolish, naive, and used. I felt like I had spent 5 years pouring my entire soul into a vessel that was cracked from the inside. The truth, once revealed, reshaped everything. It made the past look different, made the present hurt more, made the future feel uncertain. I found myself questioning everything, every moment of affection, every word of reassurance, every promise made. Were they ever real? Or were they simply stepping stones in a plan that ended the moment they received their degree? I wanted closure, but closure felt impossible when the betrayal ran so deep. Yet as days passed, something shifted inside me. The truth, as painful as it was, also brought clarity. It peeled away the illusions I had clung to and forced me to see the relationship for what it had truly become long before it ended. It showed me that the person I loved was not the person who walked away from me. They had transformed, or maybe they had revealed who they really were. And for the first time, I realized that knowing the truth, no matter how devastating, was better than living in a lie. Rebuilding and rebirth after the emotional collapse, the narrator rises stronger, turning betrayal into empowerment, finding independence, and reclaiming their future. In the aftermath of the separation, there was an unbearable silence that filled every corner of the narrator's world. It wasn't just the absence of a person, it was the sudden disappearance of a future that had been imagined, planned, nurtured, and believed in for years. Every morning felt like waking up in a room stripped bare of meaning, with memories lingering like shadows on the walls. The narrator had invested time, soul, money, energy. 5 long years of effort that intertwined with love and hope, and all of it now felt like sand slipping through their fingers. For days, maybe weeks, time lost its structure. The narrator functioned, but only in fragments. Eating became a routine without taste. Sleeping became a negotiation with racing thoughts. The heartbreak wasn't only about a relationship ending. It was about betrayal in its cruelest form. Supporting someone through their struggle, lifting them during their lowest, believing in their dreams more fiercely than in their own, only to be left behind the moment success arrived. That kind of pain carved its shape deep into the bones. But rock bottom has an unexpected gift. When everything you were holding on to collapses, you're forced to face what remains. In this case, what remained was a devastated heart, but also a resilient spirit that refused to die. The narrator didn't rise suddenly. Healing didn't come with an inspirational sunrise or a cinematic turning point. It began quietly through tiny, almost invisible steps. The first step was acknowledging the pain, not pretending to be okay. The narrator cried when the weight became too heavy, allowed themselves to feel the loss rather than mask it. Because healing doesn't begin with denial, it begins with honesty. Then came the moment of reflection. The narrator started seeing the truth not just of the relationship, but of themselves. For years, they had pushed aside personal dreams, postponing ambitions under the belief that love meant sacrifice, complete and unbalanced sacrifice. Now, with the burden lifted, they had space to breathe, think, and reevaluate who they were outside of someone else's success. Slowly, life began reshaping itself. The narrator created new routines, morning walks that cleared the mind, journaling to release pent-up emotions, listening to music that once felt too nostalgic but now became a form of therapy. They began reconnecting with friends they had unknowingly drifted from while giving everything to the relationship. These friends became pillars, offering warmth, understanding, and the reminder that love still existed in the world, even if it wasn't romantic at the moment. Financially, the narrator faced a harsh reality. Years of supporting someone else's dreams had drained savings and delayed personal goals. But instead of seeing this as a permanent setback, the narrator treated it as a challenge, a mountain that, though steep, could be climbed with time and resilience. They took on extra work not out of necessity alone, but with a newly sharpened sense of purpose. Every paycheck became more than money. It became evidence of self-reliance, proof that rebuilding was possible. The turning point came the day the narrator looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim anymore. They saw a survivor. They saw someone who didn't collapse under betrayal, but stood back up and kept walking. Someone who realized that strength isn't measured by how well you avoid breaking, it's measured by how you put yourself back together. With this renewed clarity, the narrator began investing in their own growth for the first time in years. They enrolled in courses they had once postponed. They explored hobbies that had been forgotten, painting, reading, cooking, even traveling short distances, just to rediscover what freedom felt like. Every new experience, big or small, added threads to the fabric of their evolving identity. There were moments of relapse, of course. Nights when memories reopened old wounds, days when loneliness whispered hurtful reminders of what was lost. But healing isn't a straight line. The narrator learned to treat these moments not as failures but as part of the journey. They learned to forgive themselves for feeling, for hurting, for remembering. They learned that moving on doesn't require forgetting, it requires understanding. The betrayal once felt like a chain wrapped around their heart, but now it was being reshaped into something else, a lesson, a boundary, a promise to themselves. They vowed never again to shrink their own dreams to elevate someone else's, never again to confuse love with one-sided sacrifice, never again to ignore their worth. In this process, self-love stopped being a cliché and became a lifeline. The narrator began treating themselves with the kindness they had once reserved for others. They healed through self-celebration, acknowledging every milestone, applauding every step forward, even if it felt small. And with time, something beautiful happened. Confidence returned. Not the fragile kind that depends on external validation, but the steady, quiet confidence built from surviving heartbreak and growing beyond it. As seasons changed, so did the narrator's heart. They no longer wanted to rewrite the past or question why things happened the way they did. Instead, they became grateful for clarity, for the painful but necessary awakening. They realized that losing someone who didn't value them wasn't a loss at all, it was a release. With their life slowly reshaping itself, new opportunities began to arise. Work improved, friendships deepened, and a newfound independence blossomed into pride. The narrator rediscovered their ambition and embraced the freedom of creating a future rooted in self-respect and personal dreams. They understood that the journey wasn't about replacing the pain, but about transforming it into strength. Eventually, the betrayal that once shattered them became the reason they rebuilt a life far stronger, far richer, and far more authentic. The narrator stood on the other side of heartbreak, not as someone who was broken, but as someone reborn, proving that sometimes the most painful endings lead to the most powerful beginnings. And in that rebirth, they found not just healing but themselves.